Welcome everyone to History Gone Wilder, part of Half History Will Travel. I'm your host, the Wilder historian, Dr. Lucas Wilder, and last time Pickett suffered his most devastating defeat at Gettysburg and executed what he believed to be traitors in North Carolina. Now we join him as the Overland Campaign has taken place and follow him to the end of the war. If you like what I do, please consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't done so already, join the Patreon page, and purchase something from one of my online stores. Every little bit helps. Thank you. During the Overland Campaign, as Ulysses S. Grant battered Robert E. Lee's army from the Rappahannock and Rapidan rivers to just outside of Richmond, Pickett's division remained as kind of a mobile reserve, not seeing much action during the entire campaign. By mid-June, Grant and the Army of the Potomac, along with the Army of the James, began their operations against Petersburg, Virginia. In the division's first major action of 1864, Pickett rushed to secure the Howlett Line, a series of entrenchments at Bermuda Hundred. His actions in mid-June helped prevent the Army of the James from capturing the only rail line running from Petersburg to Richmond, prolonging the war by forcing Grant to try to capture Petersburg. Once the Howlett Line was stabilized, Pickett and his division settled into trench warfare, occupying that line of entrenchments from June 1864 until March of 1865. Now, parts of his division were dispatched to areas east of Richmond and toward Petersburg, but Pickett's duties remained protecting the Howlett Line. Pickett and Sally welcomed their first child into the world in the summer of 1864, a boy they named George Jr. Men of the division clamored for a chance to hold the baby. Sally remembered, "I am ashamed to confess it, but notwithstanding the gentleness of the soldiers, baby's quiet, peaceful mind, and the general's continued assurance that he was all right, I, his very new and solicitous mother, suffered agonies of torture and anxiety until he was back again in my arms. And oh dear, what a greasy, dirty, grimy little bundle it was when I did get it back." From November 1864 to March 1865, Pickett's division suffered an incredible amount of desertions. In less than a 10-day period in March of 1865, 10% of Pickett's force deserted. On January 19, 1865, Lee wrote to James Longstreet of his deep dissatisfaction with the conditions in Pickett's division. In one brigade, Lee chided, the articles of war were seldom read, accommodations for the sick bad, and religious exercise neglected. He labeled another unsoldierly and unmilitary, lax in discipline, and loose in military instruction. Lee suggested that Pickett and his officers were not sufficiently attentive to the men and not informed as to their condition. Lee warned Longstreet that unless the division and brigade commanders are careful and energetic, nothing can be accomplished. Pickett was Longstreet's responsibility as a subordinate and as a friend. Lee directed Longstreet to do all in his power to correct the evils in Pickett's division. In late March 1865, Grant was determined to oust Lee from his Petersburg defenses and maneuvered cavalry and infantry to the extreme Confederate right to force Lee's hand and abandon the city. Lee dispatched Pickett's division to the Confederate right. Pickett met with Lee where they discussed the operations to throw back Grant's attack. It's unclear why Lee chose Pickett to command the operation. Lee didn't have much faith in Pickett's ability, yet he was given command of his own division, 2 brigades from Bushrod Johnson's division, and some cavalry. Pickett left Petersburg and marched for nearly 18 hours on March 30th to a crossroads called Five Forks. The men were worn out, and Pickett decided to wait until morning to launch an attack. The next day, Pickett launched an attack that was slightly mismanaged, with the cavalry attacking before the infantry was ready, but Pickett drove the enemy from the field, toward Dinwiddie Courthouse. However, in an odd move, Pickett halted his men. Sunset was coming on, but many of his men believed there was plenty of time to make the battle more complete for the Confederacy. Nevertheless, the men halted, and Pickett dug in along White Oak Road. The next day, on April 1st, between noon and 1 p.m., Pickett left his command, traveling 1 mile to the rear of his position to take part in a shad bake put together by cavalry officer Thomas Rosser. Many of his men didn't know he had left the field or where he had gone when the Union forces launched their own attack against their hastily thrown-up line. Union General Philip Sheridan threw a huge infantry force against the Confederate position, caving in the left flank of Pickett's line. Pickett remained unconcerned until he witnessed 2 couriers that he had sent to the front get captured in front of his eyes. as the Union had made their way a mile into the Confederate rear. When a messenger from the cavalry tried to give Pickett a report, Pickett kept riding saying, "Don't talk to me." Pickett's presence at the front did him no good as his men began running for the rear. Thousands were picked up as prisoners. Would Pickett's presence at the front from the beginning have prevented disaster? Probably not. The numbers were too overwhelming, but his actions were definitely negligent. The Union victory at Five Forks led to a breakthrough in the Confederate line the following day, forcing the Confederate government as well as Lee's army to flee Richmond. Pickett and the last remnants of his command marched west with the rest of the army. At Sailor's Creek, in a stand against the approaching Federals, Pickett's division broke as well as other Confederate forces, giving the Union another victory. Shortly before making it to Appomattox Courthouse, Lee relieved Pickett of command, but he never left. Some say he never received the order, and others say he received it but refused to obey the order. Nevertheless, when Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse and the men were being paroled, Lee saw Pickett and asked, "Is that man still with this army?" Following his parole, Pickett went back to Richmond to be with Sally. She had remained behind when the army left. They were destitute. Pickett had been in uniform for 25 years, knowing no other occupation. His family home was in ashes, so he and Sally moved in with her family. On June 1st, he sent an application in to President Andrew Johnson, looking for a pardon. He claimed that if Virginia had not seceded, then he would have stayed with the old army, and that he loved the United States and hated to let go of that army. He became horrified when he found out that he was being investigated for war crimes for his actions in North Carolina. Fearing for his life, he, Sally, and George Jr. moved to Canada. They rented a room in Montreal, and to get by they borrowed money from family and other exiled Confederates. Sally allegedly sold her jewelry and taught Latin to help provide for the family. Pickett was ill and was mostly confined to his bed while in Canada. While the Picketts were there, friends and family went to the President and Grant to obtain a pardon for the general, but none of them succeeded. Grant believed that tempers hadn't cooled enough for Pickett's pardon. In December 1865, the Picketts moved back to Virginia, hoping they could regain some type of normalcy. On March 12, 1866, Pickett wrote to his West Point friend Ulysses S. Grant personally to ask for a pardon. The plea must have seemed genuine to Grant because on the day he received the letter, he sent an endorsement to President Johnson to look over the incident in North Carolina. Johnson would hold the request for a few more months, though. No charges would be brought against Pickett. It appears that Grant's endorsement succeeded. Still, Pickett would not receive a personal pardon. His pardon would come in December 1868 in Johnson's general amnesty. Pickett built a small cottage for his family near the ruins of his family's plantation house. He wrote, "Everything has been swept clean by the ruthless war: houses, dwellings, barns, stables, ice house, and slave quarters. Fences, of course, and every fruit or ornamental tree, vineyard, and shrubs and flowers." He found he wasn't gifted as a farmer and resorted to selling insurance for a New York-based company with an office in Norfolk. Although he became the president of the Southern Historical Society and helped to organize the Association of the Army of Northern Virginia, he wasn't outspoken about his time in the war. According to his wife, he didn't want to fight the battles over again. George Pickett still brooded about his failed charge at Gettysburg. As Robert E. Lee became the patron saint of the fallen Confederacy, Pickett continued to nurse his resentment toward his former commander. Pickett saw Lee again, briefly and accidentally, in a Richmond hotel. John Singleton Mosby, who witnessed the strained exchange between two officers, recalled that Lee was capable of freezing out a man he did not like. As Pickett left, he allegedly remarked to Mosby, "He had my division massacred at Gettysburg." Mosby sharply replied, "Well, it made you immortal." As the story goes, reporters asked Pickett why the charge at Gettysburg failed, and he would reply, "Well, I think the Yankees had something to do with it." Pickett and Sally welcomed another son into the world in these post-war years. They named him Corbell, Sally's maiden name. Pickett despaired over not being able to provide a more comfortable life for his family. He knew that Sally had come from a better home than he could now provide for her. In a letter to a family member, he was so distraught over the situation, he wrote, "I am a child." This statement indicated that he felt powerless to help his own situation. Pickett hoped to regain some glory and hoped for a foreign war to restore him. If Grant should inaugurate a new foreign policy and get the general attention diverted from the woolly head by a skirmish with something outside, why then we may hope for peace at home, and some of us may get occupation abroad. In the spring of 1874, their youngest son, Corbel, died of measles. The next year, 1875, Pickett fell ill while on business in Norfolk from what was called gastric fever. As he lay dying, he said, "I do not want anybody but my wife." The room was cleared, and he passed away. He was 50 years old. He initially was buried in Cedar Grove Cemetery in Norfolk, but disinterred later that year to be reburied in Hollywood Cemetery in Richmond. During the reburial, it was said 40,000 people lined the streets to watch the funeral procession, which contained 5,000 people. Sally, although hindered by health problems, long outlived her husband, keeping his name alive by writing numerous works and attending reunions, where she recounted his heroic deeds. Her work seemed to be mostly fictional, and it's difficult to understand what is truth and what is fiction as historians sift through the material. Sally kept in touch with her husband's half-Native American son on the West Coast, staying in communication with him for 15 years. James Tilton Pickett never saw his father after Pickett left to fight in the war in 1861. James was a talented artist, attending the San Francisco School of Design. He would eventually work at the Seattle Post-Intelligencer and the Portland Oregonian. George Jr. went to meet his half-brother, but the interaction didn't go well. George Jr. apparently didn't care for the interracial status of his half-brother and made a derogatory comment about it to James, which resulted in their meeting being anything but cordial. Sally never did recognize James publicly, but signed her letters, "Your love and your devoted mother," as well as calling him son. She never got to meet him because her health prevented her from making the journey. James would die of tuberculosis at the age of 31 in 1889. Sally continued to promote her husband throughout her life, never remarrying. She died on March 22, 1931, in Rockville, Maryland. George Pickett gained immortality because of a defeat turned into an iconic moment by his wife, who sought to keep his name alive. Pickett never got over the loss. It signaled an important and depressing moment in his life. Gone were the days of aggression and courage. He felt abandoned by the army he loved. Did Pickett rise above his own abilities? Many of his biographers and historians of the war believe it to be true. Even his own biographers admit to his ineptness at command. One wrote, "Pickett habitually left his division command to visit his lover. This was someone who repeatedly held a distorted view of his responsibilities and the threats he faced. In the immediate aftermath at Gettysburg, Pickett was so consumed with his own grief that he wandered about the field aimlessly, sobbing openly. Throughout the Civil War and his entire military career, he proved to be an officer unwilling to admit error or take responsibility for his own actions. At New Bern and Gettysburg, Pickett lashed out at others for his own mistakes, and Five Forks was no different. In his report, he reproached Lee for failing to send reinforcements and criticized him for choosing Five Forks rather than a position behind Hatcher's Run. Pickett even blamed his lunch partner, Fitz Lee, for failing to protect the left flank. This was probably the same sort of unproductive and unprofessional complaining with which Pickett filled his infamous loss report from Gettysburg. Pickett's temper got the best of him in many situations, including his pre-war station in the Northwest at San Juan Island. He held grudges against Robert E. Lee and hastily blamed others instead of looking at his own responsibilities. As a brigade commander, Pickett was aggressive and capable. Utilized at the correct moment, he could hold on to a position despite overwhelming odds against him. His wounding put him on the sidelines during some of the most defining moments of the war for the Army of Northern Virginia, the Second Battle of Manassas, and the Battle of Antietam. When the Army was reorganized, he was made a division commander and never fully acquired the capability of managing a division in combat. He wasn't engaged at Fredericksburg, and during Longstreet's expedition to Suffolk, Pickett spent more time at Sally's than with his own division. By the time the Union and the Confederacy met at Gettysburg, Pickett was horribly inexperienced as a division commander, and despite his excitement, he wasn't prepared. As said before, Pickett's charge changed the namesake of the attack, and not for the better. He carried it with him into his post-war life. He struggled to make ends meet, and it seemed as though his life felt unfulfilled. Nonetheless, he gained immortality because of his wife's efforts to keep his name alive. It was partly because of her that Pickett's charge bears her husband's name. Despite 2 other divisions taking part in the attack, Pickett's command stood out because Virginians were highly revered in the post-war years because of the leaders who became canonized, like Lee and Stonewall Jackson. Unfortunately for Pickett, he will always be remembered for 2 Civil War moments, none of them flattering to himself: the failed attack at Gettysburg, and his dereliction of duty at Five Forks by attending a shad bake instead of seeing to his troops. George Pickett's legacy remains a complex blend of military valor and tragic miscalculation, forever tied to the ill-fated charge at Gettysburg that bore his name. Despite his post-war struggles and controversial reputation, he is remembered as a symbol of the Confederacy's fleeting hopes and ultimate defeat. The famed Southern author William Faulkner added to the Pickett's charge mythology in his own work, Intruder in the Dust. For every Southern boy 14 years old, not once, but whenever he wants it, there is the instant when it's still not yet 2 o'clock on that July afternoon in 1863. The brigades are in position behind the rail fence, the guns are laid and ready in the woods, and the furled flags are already loosened to break out, and Pickett himself, with his long old ringlets, and his hat in one hand probably, and his sword in the other, looking up the hill waiting for Longstreet to give the word, and it's all in the balance. It hasn't happened yet. It hasn't even begun yet. It not only hasn't begun yet, but there is still time for it not to begin against that position and those circumstances, which made more men than Garnett and Kemper and Armistead and Wilcox look grave, yet it's going to begin. We all know that. We have come too far with too much at stake, and that moment doesn't need even a 14-year-old boy to think this time, maybe this time, with all this much to lose and all this much to gain. Pennsylvania, Maryland, the world, the Golden Dome of Washington itself to crown with desperate and unbelievable victory the desperate gamble, the cast made 2 years ago.